The rivalry between the M2 Browning and Soviet DShK is one of the most insane parts of military history. They both completely changed modern warfare by creating the heavy machine gun class, and have since been shooting at each other in the tropical jungles of Vietnam to the cold valleys of Korea. The guns can be seen in everything from the infamous Catalina plane of Call of Duty World at War to Rambo's DShK in 1988. But what truly occurred during the fierce and bloody rivalry these two guns have had, and why can most historians today still not answer which gun is better? We'll provide the information so you can decide for yourself. But I have to warn you, this rivalry is darker than most understand, and is not for the faint-hearted. You see, by 1917, the military landscape had completely mutated into a thing that no ordinary rifle could answer anymore. The Germans had rolled out the Junkers JI, an attack plane whose pilot sat inside a steel bathtub that simply didn't care about normal bullets. And down in the dirt of the Western Front came the first tanks, plus a brutal new German anti-tank rifle called the Mauser Tankgewehr that could hold a fat 13mm round. Normal rifle rounds usually just pinged off the lot of it, and that terrified the generals and the men in suits dictating the wars. Up to this point, a machine gun meant a rifle-caliber weapon, which was lethal against men in the open, but useless against anything fortified with steel. So the American commander, General John Blackjack Pershing, put in a savage demand in the summer of 1917. He wanted a machine gun no smaller than half an inch across, throwing its round at 2,700 feet per second, heavy enough to gut armor and drop planes clean out of the sky. And he handed that job to none other than John Moses Browning, arguably the most gifted gun designer who ever lived. But the weapon Browning was about to build would arrive far too late for the very war that had demanded it. Browning took his .30 caliber M1917 and supersized it into a monster, while Winchester cooked up a giant new cartridge to feed the thing. They even captured a few German T-Gewehrs to study the ammo, then made their new .50 caliber round meaner than that. The first gun was fired on the 15th of October 1918, and ultimately it missed the whole Great War by a few weeks. It became the water-cooled M1921, and by 1933, it matured into the weapon the world would learn to dread, the M2 Browning, nicknamed Ma-Deuce, firing the feared and unignorable 50 BMG. This was the gun that effectively founded a brand new class of weapon, the true heavy machine gun, built to gut armor and aircraft rather than infantry. And what made it so feared was the sheer flexibility, because the same receiver could be set up 7 different ways for infantry, vehicles, aircraft, or pointing straight up at the heavens. So one basic design could do nearly every heavy job an army might ask of it, and cracking a plane out of the sky with bullets stopped being a fantasy and became a daily reality. But while America perfected its monster, another empire was watching from the east, and it wanted a 50 of its very own. The Soviets saw the same nightmare future of planes and armor coming, and in 1929 they issued almost the identical demand. Their man, Vasily Degtyaryov, built the DK in 1930, a 12.7 times 108mm beast fed by a clumsy 30-round drum that perched on top, jammed often, and ran dry far too quickly. That feed problem crippled the thing, since a heavy gun that empties in seconds is no use against a fast aircraft, so it was made in tiny numbers and slowly abandoned by 1935. So how on earth did a discarded failure go on to become the most widespread heavy machine gun on the entire planet? Well, a designer named Georgy Shpagin fixed the one fatal flaw. He bolted on a smooth belt feed, and in 1938, the gun was reborn as the DShK, affectionately nicknamed the DShK, which roughly means darling. It threw its 12.7mm round at around 850 meters a second, and could punch through more than half an inch of armor plate out to 500 meters. The two rivals even worked in opposite ways under the hood, since the Browning used its own recoil to cycle the action, while the DShK tapped gas straight off the barrel to do the very same job. Different engineering on the inside, yet the same brutal result coming out of the muzzle. Now you had two guns, two empires, and one shared idea, and these two would spend the next 70 years trying to butcher each other's crews across half the planet. But before they were ever enemies, believe it or not, these two guns actually fought side by side. All through the Second World War, the Browning hung off nearly every American plane, ship, and tank, while the DShK rode the turret of the Soviet IS-2 and the beds of supply trucks, both of them blasting away at the same German aircraft. The Germans even snatched up captured DShKs and turned them straight back on their old owners, which tells you just how good the gun already was. So for a few short years, these two 50s were allies, pointed at the very same enemy. But the instant that war ended, the world cracked into two halves, and the guns cracked apart right along with it. And the first time they truly squared off against each other was in the frozen valleys of Korea. When North Korea invaded across the border in 1950, both guns were already grizzled veterans of the last war. Yet they walked into this fight wearing wildly different jobs. The Browning ruled the air before it ever touched the ground, because 650s sat packed into the nose of the F-86 Sabre. High above the Yalu River, those guns dueled Soviet-built MiGs in the first great jet versus jet battles in human history. In a patch of sky the pilots christened MiG Alley, the Browning's whole job up there was to hose a streaking jet in the half-second it stayed in the sights, and by the war's end, those 50-armed Sabres had come out well ahead of the MiGs. But down on the ground, that very same gun would find itself handed a far darker calling. The Americans took 4 M2s, clamped them into one power-driven turret called the M45 quad mount, and drove the whole contraption around on a half-track as the M16. It was built to shred low-flying aircraft, spitting out well over 2,000 rounds a minute. Korea, though, would soon hand that gun a target it was never designed for. You see, when Chinese infantry came surging through the dark in their massed night assaults, commanders simply swung the Quad 50 around and aimed it straight at the men. The soldiers gave the rig a nickname that tells you everything you need to know about what it did. They called it the meat chopper. 450s firing together turned a frontal human wave into something the survivors spent the rest of their lives trying to forget. And when it was not slaughtering attackers, it guarded convoys behind a wall of fire nobody wanted to walk into. And on the far side of that frozen no man's land, the DShK was crouched in the dirt, waiting for the planes. North Korea and their Chinese allies leaned hard on the DShK as their answer to American air power, lacing the valleys and supply roads with 12.7mm guns that pointed straight up. They could not outfly the Sabre, but they could turn every low strafing pass into a deadly gamble. A single DShK tucked on a hillside could force a whole flight of fighter bombers to climb higher and bomb far worse. But the DShK was never just an anti-aircraft gun, because wheeled out on its low shield mount, it tore into UN infantry and light bunkers from clear across the valley. So it did on the ground exactly what the Browning was doing from the American tanks, and for the very first time, the two rivals were aimed at each other's armies in the same war at the same time. By 1953, the Americans had dragged enough captured DShKs home to test them properly, and their verdict came back smug, deciding the M2 was simply the superior weapon, which on paper it absolutely was. But that smugness would end up costing them an ocean of blood, because while the American planners congratulated themselves, they shrugged off the one detail that actually mattered. The communists now owned a heavy machine gun of their very own, packed up and ready to travel to every brushfire war about to ignite. Even worse, China had begun churning out its own copy of the DShK, the Type 54, so the supply was about to multiply, and somehow the rivalry between the two 50s would only escalate, and nowhere would that grim journey prove deadlier than in the jungles waiting down in Vietnam. This is where the rivalry turned truly personal, because in Vietnam the two guns stopped fighting at arm's length and started wearing each other's parts. The DShK flooded south in enormous numbers, joined everywhere by its Chinese twin, the Type 54. The North could not contest the American jets up in the clouds, so they did the next best thing and choked the ground with guns instead. By the height of the war, they had stockpiled well over 8,000 anti-aircraft weapons, strung along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and ringed around every target worth defending. The DShK was light enough to smuggle through Laos and Cambodia on bicycles and men's backs, then snapped back together to lurk beneath the jungle canopy. A gunner would dig the wheeled mount into a ridge, screw on the spiderweb anti-aircraft sight, and simply wait for the thump of rotor blades, and the prey came in low and slow, flying right into the teeth of those guns. The American helicopter war dropped Hueys straight into the path of all that 12.7mm fire. A DShK could fling its rounds nearly 2 kilometers into the sky, so there was no comfortable altitude where a slow helicopter ever felt truly safe. Of the thousands of U.S. aircraft and helicopters lost across the entire war, more than 5,600 were helicopters, and it was this light ground fire, far more than the missiles or the MiGs, that did most of the butchering. The one mercy for the Americans was that plenty of enemy gunners never learned to properly lead a fast helicopter, so a lot of rounds sailed harmlessly behind the tailboom. A Huey crew that took fire would dive below the treetops and pour on the power, racing to escape the range before a gunner found the right aim. And at night, the sight was its own special kind of terror, with glowing tracers firing up out of the black jungle straight at the cockpit glass. Yet the single cruelest twist of the whole war was what the Viet Cong did once they got their hands on the M2 Browning. You see, when the VC stripped a captured M2 off a wrecked vehicle or an overrun firebase, they did not simply point it back and pull the trigger. They machined it to bolt straight onto a Soviet DShK tripod. The two great rivals fused into one single weapon, aimed right back at the very men who had built one of them. A 1966 Marine intelligence report counted whole enemy battalions running these Frankenstein 50s beside their DShKs, sometimes as many as 9 of the things to a single infantry battalion. That same report clocked the gun's practical rate of fire at only about 125 rounds a minute, since a jungle crew had to keep swapping belts and letting the barrel cool. Meanwhile, the Americans were using the Browning all over the place, firing straight back at the Viet Cong. It was the door gun hanging out of the Hueys, the heavy punch of the Navy's river patrol boats sliding through the Mekong, and the weapon bolted onto nearly every other vehicle. A door gunner leaning into a Browning was often the only thing keeping a packed helicopter alive over a hot landing zone. And down on the rivers, a patrol boat crew would answer an ambush from the banks with a wall of .50 caliber fire that tore the tree line to splinters. And when the Saigon finally fell and the Vietnam War ended, the DShK simply packed itself up and moved on to its next mountain range, but instead turned back on the Soviets, where it would soon hunt the deadliest helicopter ever built. When the Soviets rolled into Afghanistan in 1979, they brought a monster with them, and that monster had been engineered for one purpose: to beat the M2 Browning. You see, the Russians had studied Vietnam very closely indeed. They watched what all that light ground fire did to American helicopters. So they built the Mi-24 Hind to laugh straight in its face. They wrapped the cockpit in armor thick enough to shrug off a heavy machine gun round, the exact threat any enemy down below would be flinging up at it. The Afghans named the Hind Shaitan Arba, meaning Satan's chariot, and they dreaded it for very good reason. It could hover over a village, soak up gunfire, and rake the ground with rockets and cannon, while the rebels' bullets just bounced off the canopy. Now here is the bitter joke buried right inside the whole war. The Mujahideen's most prized heavy weapon was the DShK, valued above almost everything else they owned, dragged up goat tracks onto bare ridgelines to ambush the aircraft below. Heavy machine guns were so scarce and so precious that whole bands of fighters would plan an entire operation around a single DShK. And when they were lucky enough to own a few, the gunners would space them around a valley to catch the low aircraft in a crossfire it would not twist out of. But the Soviets had armored the Hind against the American 50, and their own Soviet DShK fired a round in that very same weight class. So the rebels' 12.7mm slugs frequently just skittered off Satan's chariot, and the gun that helped invent the heavy machine gun legend was being shrugged off by armor built to stop its own American rival. Still, the old DShK was very far from useless, and it drew plenty of blood from those valleys. The Mi-8 transport carried a much thinner skin than the Hind, which left it wide open to 12.7mm fire. The Afghan gunners knocked several of them clean out of the air. A DShK team that caught a loaded Mi-8 flaring into land could turn a routine flight into a fireball in seconds. And the smartest crews learned to climb above their target on the high ridges, firing down onto the thinner top of a helicopter where the armor finally gave them a fighting chance. So the DShK ruled those valleys all the way up to 1986. But then something unexpected happened. The Americans handed the rebels something that made the old machine gun look like a relic overnight. That year, the CIA slipped the Mujahideen the American Stinger missile, and the very first salvo on the 25th of September 1986 brought 3 Hinds down on the spot near Jalalabad. From then on, Satan's chariot began tumbling out of the sky for good, and the old heavy machine gun took a back seat to the missile. And somehow, by the time the beaten Soviets limped home in 1989, both guns had passed the half-century mark, and neither one was anywhere close to retiring. Here is the part that honestly should not make any sense at all. 2 machine guns sketched out before the Second World War, one even all the way back in World War I, are still shooting soldiers all across the globe right now, today. The DShK alone was built well over 1 million times once you count every Soviet gun and foreign copy, which is a big part of why it simply never went away. Russia did eventually try to put it out to pasture, swapping it first for the NSV and later the Cord, but the old gun flatly refused to give up. For every shiny new cord in a Russian arsenal, there are countless tired old DShKs still scattered across dozens of armies and militias around the world. It rides bolted to the back of pickup trucks from Syria to Libya, the homemade technical that practically defines modern guerrilla warfare. And the old gun's reach stretches a great deal further than just the deserts of the Middle East. The IRA got hold of a batch of them smuggled out of Libya, and in 1988, they raked a British Army Lynx helicopter with 15 separate hits over South Armagh. And right now, the DShK sits in the trenches of Ukraine, mounted on trucks and dug into firing pits, doing the exact job it was handed all the way back in 1938. The Browning, meanwhile, never even bothered to pretend it would retire. It is still the standard heavy machine gun of the United States and dozens of other armies, the same core-design Browning scratched out in 1918, still riding on Humvees, warships, and gun trucks. It holds a fair claim to being the longest-serving firearm in all of American military history, and a full century after its first shot rang out, no army has found a real reason to swap it for anything else. The man himself, John Moses Browning, died back in 1926, years before his gun even earned its famous M2 name. And over in Ukraine today, on both sides of one shredded front line, you can find a Browning and a DShK unleashing its wrath at each other across the same muddy fields, more than 80 years deep into their feud. So which one is actually the better gun? Well, here is the strangest part of the entire rivalry. Both guns are the same half-inch caliber, yet they swallow completely different cartridges. The American 12.7x99 and the Soviet 12.7x108. To this very day, neither gun can fire the other's ammo, so the rivalry is baked right into the brass itself. The Americans always swore by the M2, and on paper, its 50 BMG hits harder and shoots flatter than its rival. But the DShK was simpler, cheaper, and far easier to spread around, and you could nurse one back to life with a hammer in the back of a cave. Both outlived the men who designed them, and both are still being fed fresh belts of ammunition this very afternoon.